Welcome back to Shadow Trail Files. I'm your host, and today we're traveling deep into the forgotten Appalachian towns scattered across some of the oldest mountains in North America. These small communities may look peaceful during the day, but behind their quiet streets lie chilling stories of unexplained disappearances, strange encounters, and terrifying events that locals still refuse to talk about. Before we begin, if you're new here, we document the strange, the terrifying, and the unexplained from America's wilderness areas and remote mountain towns. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Story 1. My name is Ryan Carter, and in the fall of 2019, I experienced something in a small Appalachian town that I still can't explain. At the time, I was traveling through the mountains, looking for old places to photograph for a personal project. One afternoon, I arrived in a quiet town called Black Ridge, a place so small that it had only a gas station, a diner, a church, and a few dozen houses scattered between the hills. While eating dinner at the local diner, I overheard several older residents talking about an abandoned house on the edge of town. Every time someone mentioned the house, the others became uncomfortable and quickly changed the subject. Curious, I asked a waitress about it. She hesitated before telling me that locals avoided the property after dark because strange things had happened there for years. According to her, people reported seeing lights inside the empty house, hearing voices from rooms that should have been vacant, and occasionally spotting someone standing in the upstairs window. I assumed it was just another local ghost story. That evening, shortly before sunset, I decided to visit the place myself. The house sat at the end of a narrow dirt road surrounded by dense forest. It looked abandoned for decades. The porch sagged toward the ground, several windows were broken, and vines climbed the walls. As I approached, a strange feeling settled over me. The entire area was silent. No birds, no insects, no wind, just silence. Still, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and rotting wood. My flashlight illuminated old furniture, covered in thick layers of dirt. I moved carefully through the rooms, taking photos and recording video with my phone. Everything seemed normal until I reached the second floor. While standing in a hallway lined with bedroom doors, I heard what sounded like footsteps directly above me. The problem was, there wasn't another floor above the second floor. The footsteps continued slowly for several seconds before stopping. I remember standing perfectly still, listening. Then I heard a door close somewhere down the hallway. The sound was loud enough to echo through the house. I immediately shined my flashlight toward the noise and noticed something strange. One of the bedroom doors that had been open when I arrived was now closed. My heart started pounding. I walked toward it and slowly pushed it open. The room was empty. However, sitting in the middle of the floor was a wooden rocking chair facing the doorway. I know it hadn't been there before because I had looked into the room earlier. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard another sound behind me. It was breathing. Slow, deep breathing. The kind you hear when someone is standing only a few feet away. I spun around, expecting to find another person in the hallway. but there was nobody there. The breathing stopped instantly. At that point, I decided I had seen enough and headed downstairs. Halfway down the staircase, I heard a loud bang from one of the rooms above me, followed by what sounded like someone running across the floor. I didn't stop to investigate. I hurried out the front door and into the fading evening light. As soon as I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a figure standing near the tree line about 50 yards away. It looked like a man. He was completely motionless and partially hidden by the shadows. I couldn't make out any facial features, but I could tell he was watching me, thinking it might be a local trying to scare visitors. I shouted, asking who he was. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move at all. I quickly walked toward my car while keeping my eyes on him. The moment I reached the driver's door and glanced away for a second, the figure was gone. Just gone. There was nowhere. He could have disappeared that quickly. Feeling genuinely unsettled, I got into my car and drove back toward town. The road wound through thick forest, and darkness had completely fallen by then. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights behind me. At first I thought it was another vehicle, but something felt wrong. The headlights remained exactly the same distance behind me, no matter how fast or slow I drove. Every curve, every hill, they stayed there. Eventually, I became nervous to speed up. The headlights matched my speed instantly. This continued for nearly 15 minutes, until I reached the outskirts of town. The moment I passed, beneath the first streetlight, I looked into my rearview mirror again. The headlights had vanished. There were no side roads, no driveways, and nowhere for another vehicle to turn off. They were simply gone. The next morning, I stopped at the diner before leaving town and mentioned what had happened to an elderly man sitting at the counter. His expression changed immediately. After a long silence, he told me that more than 40 years earlier, a family living in that house had disappeared during the night. No signs of a struggle were ever found. No bodies were recovered. The investigation led nowhere. Then he said something I'll never forget. According to local rumors, several people who visited the property over the years reported seeing a man standing near the woods watching the house. Every witness described him exactly the same way. Tall, motionless, silent. When I showed the old man the photograph I had taken outside before leaving, the color drained from his face. Hidden between the trees in the background was the outline of a man staring directly toward the camera. I never saw him when I took the picture. I left Black Ridge that morning and never returned. To this day, whenever I look at that photograph, I remember the feeling of being watched in those mountains, and I still wonder who or what was standing among those trees waiting for darkness to fall. Story 2. My name is Ethan Walker, and this happened to me in the winter of 2021. While I was driving through a remote Appalachian town called Pine Creek. I had been traveling for work and was trying to reach my hotel before a snowstorm hit the mountains. It was already dark when my GPS directed me off the main highway and onto a narrow back road that cut through the forest. The deeper I drove into the mountains, the worse the weather became. Snow fell heavily, visibility dropped, and eventually I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly an hour. Around 10:30 p.m., I passed through Pine Creek, a tiny town consisting of a few houses, a gas station, and a church sitting beside the road. Most of the buildings were dark, but one thing immediately caught my attention. Standing near the church was a group of people dressed entirely in black. There must have been 20 or 30 of them. They weren't talking. They weren't moving. They were simply standing there in complete silence facing the church. I slowed down, expecting to see some kind of funeral or gathering, but something about the scene felt wrong. The town appeared deserted, yet these people stood perfectly still despite the freezing weather as I drove past. Several of them slowly turned their heads and looked directly at my vehicle. I remember feeling a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. A few miles later, my GPS suddenly lost signal. Then my phone lost signal too. The road ahead disappeared into thick forest, and before long I realized I was lost. I continued driving until I spotted a small roadside motel, illuminated by a flickering neon sign. Relieved, I pulled into the parking lot. The motel looked old and nearly abandoned. Only one room appeared occupied. Inside the office sat an elderly woman reading a book. She barely looked up when I entered after renting a room. I casually mentioned the people gathered near the church in town. The woman immediately stopped turning pages. Without looking at me, she asked, "You didn't stop, did you?" Confused, I told her no. She remained silent for several seconds before quietly saying, "Good." When I asked what she meant, she simply handed me my room key and told me to lock the door after dark. Her reaction unsettled me, but I assumed she was just superstitious. My room was small but clean. Around midnight, I was preparing to sleep when I heard something outside. At first it sounded like footsteps crunching through snow. Then another set, then another. Curious, I looked through the curtains. My stomach instantly dropped. Standing outside my room were dozens of people, dressed in black. The same people I had seen near the church. They stood scattered throughout the parking lot, facing my window. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply stared at the building. Panic set in. I stepped back from the window and immediately locked the door. For several minutes nothing happened. Then I heard a soft knock, 3 slow taps. The knock came from my door. I froze. Another 3 taps followed. Then silence. I approached cautiously and looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. The parking lot outside appeared empty. Thinking they had left, I glanced through the curtains again. The people were gone. Every single one of them. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke. Suddenly, I heard the sound of whispering. It seemed to be coming from outside the room. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but as I listened more carefully, I realized multiple voices were repeating the same phrase over and over. "Come outside." The whispering continued for several minutes. My heart pounded as I sat frozen on the bed. Then the voices stopped. A few seconds later, something scratched slowly across my window. I forced myself to look. Standing inches from the glass was a pale-faced man, wearing black clothing. His eyes appeared completely black in the darkness. He wasn't blinking, he wasn't moving. He was simply staring at me. I jumped backward and reached for my phone, but there was still no signal. When I looked back toward the window, the man was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The moment the sun rose, I packed my things and rushed to the office. The elderly woman was already awake. Before I could say anything, she asked if I had looked outside after midnight. I told her what I had seen. She sighed heavily and explained that for decades locals had reported strange gatherings near the church. According to old stories, many years ago, a bus carrying church members crashed during a blizzard outside town, killing everyone on board. Since then, residents occasionally reported seeing groups of silent figures dressed in black appearing during severe winter storms. The sightings always occurred late at night and almost always near the church. I asked if she believed the stories were true. She stared at me for a moment before replying, "Most people around here do." As I prepared to leave, she handed me a faded newspaper clipping. The article described the bus accident and included a photograph of the victims standing outside the church just days before the crash. My blood ran cold as I looked at the picture. Several of the faces were identical to the people I had seen staring at my motel room window the night before. I left Pine Creek immediately and never returned. Even now, years later, I still avoid driving through the Appalachian mountains during winter storms because every time snow begins falling heavily at night, I remember those silent figures standing in the dark, waiting outside my room, watching me through the glass. Story 3. I wasn't planning to tell this story publicly because for a long time I convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation for what happened. But the truth is that 5 years have passed and I still don't have one. In the summer of 2018, I was working as a delivery driver in the Appalachian region of eastern Kentucky. Most of my routes took me through small mountain towns where everybody knew each other and strangers stood out immediately. One Friday afternoon, I was assigned a delivery to a place called Raven's Gap, a tiny community tucked deep between forest-covered ridges. The delivery itself was routine, but while unloading supplies at a local hardware store, I overheard several residents discussing a missing teenager named Caleb. According to them, the 17-year-old had vanished 3 days earlier after leaving home for a short walk. Search teams, volunteers, and local deputies had spent days combing the surrounding mountains without finding a single clue. Missing person cases weren't unheard of in the Appalachians, so I didn't think much about it. I completed my route and started the drive back toward the highway. About 20 minutes outside town, I noticed something standing beside the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. It was a teenage boy, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He stood completely still at the edge of the forest, looking toward the trees rather than the road. Assuming his car had broken down or he needed help, I pulled over and rolled down my window. "You okay?" I called. The boy slowly turned his head toward me. I immediately felt uncomfortable. There was nothing obviously wrong with him, but his expression seemed distant, almost vacant. He looked exhausted. After several seconds, He quietly asked if I could give him a ride back to Raven's Gap. I agreed. The boy climbed into the passenger seat and thanked me. During the drive, I tried making conversation, but he barely spoke. He answered questions with 1 or 2 words and spent most of the trip staring out the window. Then I noticed something odd. His clothes were completely clean. If he had really spent days lost in the mountains, there should have been dirt, mud, or scratches somewhere on him. There weren't. Not a single mark. When we reached town, the boy suddenly asked me to stop near the church. He thanked me again and got out. Before leaving, I asked his name. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Caleb." Then he walked away. My stomach tightened instantly. The missing teenager's name had been Caleb. I watched him disappear around the side of the church before driving to the sheriff's office a few blocks away. Excited, I told a deputy that I had just given a ride to the missing boy. Instead of looking relieved, the deputy stared at me in confusion. Then he asked me to describe him. After hearing my description, the deputy's face went pale. He left the room and returned with a photograph. It was the same teenager, the same face, the same grey hoodie. The deputy then told me something that made my blood run cold. Caleb's body had been discovered earlier that morning by a search team nearly 10 miles outside town. The sheriff's office had not publicly released the information yet because the family had not been formally notified. According to investigators, Caleb had likely died at least 2 days before I claimed to have picked him up. I insisted they were mistaken. I told them exactly where I had found him and where he had gotten out of my truck. Several deputies searched the area around the church immediately. Nobody was there. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed my truck stopping beside the church, exactly when I said it did. The footage clearly showed me speaking toward the passenger side. Then, it showed the passenger door opening and closing by itself. Nobody stepped out. Nobody appeared on camera. Investigators reviewed the footage repeatedly and couldn't explain it. I couldn't either. For weeks afterward, I tried convincing myself there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe the boy wasn't Caleb. Maybe stress had affected my memory. But then, the sheriff contacted me again. Search teams had found something near the location where I picked him up. Hidden beneath leaves and branches was Caleb's backpack. Inside was a notebook. Most of the pages were damaged by rain, but one sentence remained readable. It had been written shortly before his disappearance. The sentence read, "If anything happens to me, tell my mom I tried to come home." I still think about that day whenever someone mentions the Appalachian Mountains. Maybe there is a logical explanation buried somewhere in the facts. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that I gave a ride to a quiet teenage boy on a lonely mountain road, and, according to every official record, he had already been dead for days. Story 4. The story I'm about to tell happened in October of 2020, and unlike most scary stories you hear online, this one started with something completely ordinary. At the time, I was working for a utility company that serviced several small Appalachian towns scattered across the mountains of West Virginia. One afternoon, our office received complaints from residents of a remote town called Briar Hollow. People were reporting power fluctuations and strange outages, affecting only one section of town near an old abandoned school building. Since I happened to be the closest technician available, I was sent to investigate. I arrived shortly before sunset. Briar Hollow was tiny, with only a few hundred residents, and most of the buildings looked decades old. After checking several power lines, I couldn't find anything wrong. Everything appeared normal. However, while speaking with a local resident, an elderly man asked where I planned to work after dark. When I mentioned the abandoned school, his expression immediately changed. He told me to finish before nightfall. When I asked why, he simply replied, "Because people hear children in that building after dark." I assumed he was joking. The school had been closed since the late 1980s and was completely empty. Still, several other residents reacted the same way when I brought it up. By then, curiosity had gotten the better of me. Since the reported outages seemed concentrated around the school property, I decided to inspect the transformer located behind the building. By the time I arrived, the sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains. The school stood alone at the edge of town, surrounded by weeds and overgrown trees. Its windows were boarded up, and years of neglect had left the structure looking more like a ruin than a school. As I worked near the transformer, darkness settled over the area. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Children's laughter. It was faint but unmistakable. I stopped, working, and listened carefully. Sst. The sound seemed to come from somewhere inside the school. At first, I assumed teenagers had broken into the building. That wasn't uncommon in abandoned places. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the rear entrance. The laughter stopped. Everything became silent. The door was secured with a rusted chain, and the windows remained boarded shut. There was no obvious way for anyone to enter. Feeling slightly uneasy, I returned to the transformer and finished my inspection. Just as I packed my tools away, the laughter returned. This time it was louder. It sounded like several children running through hallways, playing and shouting. I shined my flashlight toward the building. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement behind one of the second-floor windows. The problem was that the window was completely covered by wooden boards. There shouldn't have been any visible movement at all. Deciding I had heard enough, I got into my truck and started driving back toward town. As I passed the front of the school, my headlights illuminated something standing near the entrance. A little girl. She appeared to be around 8 years old and wore an old-fashioned dress that looked decades out of date. Thinking a child was somehow outside alone after dark, I immediately stopped the truck. When I stepped out and called to her, she didn't respond. She simply stood there, staring toward the building. I walked closer. The moment my flashlight beam reached her position, she was gone. Not running away, not hiding. Gone. The area around the entrance was completely open. There was nowhere she could have disappeared within a second. At that point, I was genuinely frightened. I returned to town and stopped at a diner before heading home. When I mentioned what I had experienced, the entire room became quiet. An older woman finally explained why people avoided the school after dark. In 1967, a furnace malfunction had filled part of the building with toxic smoke during a school event. Several children died before help arrived. The tragedy devastated the town, and years later the school was permanently closed. Since then, residents occasionally reported hearing laughter, footsteps, and voices coming from the empty building at night. Some even claimed to have seen a young girl standing near the entrance before she suddenly vanished. I didn't believe every detail of the story, but I couldn't explain what I had seen. A week later, I returned during daylight hours, hoping to find a logical explanation. While walking around the property, I noticed something carved into a concrete wall near the playground. It was a list of names, the names of the children who had died in the accident. As I read through them, one name made my stomach drop. It matched the name written on a small metal badge I had found near the entrance the night I saw the little girl. At the time, I assumed it belonged to a former student. According to the memorial, however, the girl associated with that name had died more than 50 years earlier. I still have that badge stored in a drawer at home. Whenever I look at it, I remember the empty school standing in the darkness, the sound of children laughing in a building that should have been silent, and the little girl who seemed to disappear the moment the light touched her. Story 5. Before I tell this story, I should mention that I've spent most of my life hiking and exploring small Appalachian towns. I've gotten lost before, dealt with bad weather, and spent nights alone in the mountains without any problems. Because of that, I always considered myself pretty hard to scare. That changed in the fall of 2022 when I visited a forgotten Appalachian town called Ashwood. The town wasn't completely abandoned, but it was close. Only a handful of families still lived there, and many of the buildings had been empty for decades. I was passing through the area while photographing historic locations and decided to spend the night in a small roadside motel just outside town. After checking in, I walked to a nearby diner for dinner. While talking with a few locals, I noticed something strange. Every clock in the diner showed a different time. One clock was nearly 20 minutes ahead. Another was 10 minutes behind, and one wasn't moving at all. When I jokingly pointed it out, nobody laughed. Instead, an older man sitting at the counter looked at me and said, "Don't pay too much attention to time around here." Everyone else immediately changed the subject. I assumed it was some local joke I didn't understand. Later that evening, I returned to the motel and went to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly to the sound of a train whistle. The noise startled me because there were no train tracks anywhere near Ashwood. The whistle echoed through the mountains for several seconds before fading away. Curious, I looked out the window. In the distance, beyond the trees, I could see lights moving through the darkness. They appeared to belong to a train. At first, I thought I must be mistaken, but then I heard the whistle again. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and drove toward the lights. A narrow road led me through the woods and eventually to the edge of town. There, hidden behind overgrown vegetation, I discovered an old railroad crossing. The tracks were badly rusted and partially buried beneath dirt and weeds. It was obvious they hadn't been used in decades. Yet, moments earlier, I had clearly seen lights moving along them. As I stood examining the tracks, I heard the whistle again, much closer this time. Then came the sound of metal wheels rolling across rails. The noise grew louder and louder. My heart started racing. I shined my flashlight down the tracks, expecting to see a locomotive approaching. Nothing was there. The sound continued anyway. I could hear it moving toward me through the darkness, even though the tracks remained empty. Suddenly, the crossing signals beside the road activated. Red lights flashed. Bells rang. The crossing arms slowly lowered. I stared in disbelief. There was no train. The tracks were empty. Yet, the warning system behaved as if something massive were approaching. Then I felt it. The ground beneath my feet began vibrating. The sensation grew stronger until it felt like a real train was about to pass directly in front of me. The sound became deafening. For several seconds, it seemed as though an invisible locomotive thundered across the crossing. Then, just as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The bells fell silent. The crossing arms rose. The vibrations disappeared. The tracks remained empty. I stood there frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Eventually, I returned to the motel and barely slept. The next morning, I asked several residents about the railroad crossing. Most refused to discuss it, but one elderly woman finally told me a story. In 1954, a passenger train carrying dozens of people had derailed near Ashwood during a severe storm. Several cars plunged into a ravine, killing many passengers and crew members. The accident devastated the region. Shortly afterward, the rail line was abandoned and eventually removed from service. According to local legend, on certain nights, people still heard the train whistle and saw lights moving through the mountains. Some even claimed to witness an invisible train passing over the old crossing. I wasn't sure what to believe until I visited the town library before leaving. There I found newspaper archives documenting the accident. One photograph showed the exact railroad crossing I had visited. What caught my attention was the timestamp printed beneath the image. The derailment occurred at precisely 2:03 a.m. When I checked the photos on my phone from the previous night, I noticed something unsettling. The first picture I took at the crossing was timestamped 2:03 a.m. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation, but I still remember standing beside those abandoned tracks, hearing a train that wasn't there, feeling the ground shake beneath my feet, and watching crossing signals activate for something nobody could see. Even now, whenever I hear a train whistle late at night, I think about Ashwood and wonder what really passed through that crossing in the darkness. Story 6. I never believed the stories people told about Appalachian towns. Every place has its local legends, its ghost stories, and its unexplained mysteries. Most of the time, there's a reasonable explanation hiding somewhere beneath the rumors. At least, that's what I believed, until I spent a weekend in a small mountain town called Cold Creek. In the summer of 2021, I had rented a cabin there to get away from the city and spend a few days hiking and fishing. Cold Creek was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. There was one gas station, one diner, and a few dozen houses scattered along a winding road that disappeared into the mountains. The first day was completely normal. I explored the area, took photos, and had dinner at the local diner. That's where I first heard about the road. An elderly man sitting nearby overheard me asking about hiking trails and casually warned me not to drive on Hollow Road after dark. When I asked why, he simply said, "If you see someone walking, don't stop." The way he said it wasn't joking or dramatic. It sounded more like genuine advice. Before I could ask more questions, another local changed the subject. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Around 11 p.m., curiosity got the better of me. I got in my truck and drove toward Hollow Road. The road was narrow, isolated, and surrounded by dense forest on both sides. There were no houses, no streetlights, and no signs of civilization. After driving for about 15 minutes, then my headlights illuminated something ahead. A woman was walking alone down the center of the road. She wore a long white dress that looked strangely old-fashioned. Her dark hair covered most of her face. The sight was so unexpected that I instinctively slowed down. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. She wasn't carrying a flashlight. She wasn't looking around. She was simply walking straight ahead at a steady pace. Remembering the warning from the diner, I decided not to stop. I drove past at her and continued down the road. As I passed, I glanced in the mirror. The woman had stopped walking and was now standing motionless in the middle of the road, watching my truck disappear into the darkness. A few minutes later, I reached a dead end and turned around. On the drive back, I expected to see her again. The road was completely empty. Relieved, I continued toward town. Then I looked into my rearview mirror. The woman was standing in the bed of my truck. My heart nearly stopped. She stood perfectly still, her hair hanging over her face, staring directly at the rear window. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop. I jumped out and ran to the back. Nobody was there. The truck bed was empty. I searched the area with a flashlight, but found nothing except trees and darkness. By then I was badly shaken. I got back inside and drove straight to my cabin. I locked every door and tried to convince myself the darkness had played tricks on my eyes. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Back and forth, back and forth. I grabbed a flashlight and looked through the window. At first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the porch. It was the same woman. She wasn't moving. She was simply staring toward the cabin. I immediately reached for my phone to call someone, but when I looked back, she was gone. The footsteps stopped. The rest of the night passed without incident, although I barely slept. The next morning I packed my things and stopped at the diner before leaving town. He became unusually quiet. After a long pause, he explained that decades earlier, a young woman had disappeared while walking along Hollow Road after a town festival. Despite extensive searches, nobody ever found her. Over the years, drivers reported seeing a woman matching her description late at night. Some claimed she appeared beside the road. Others said she appeared in rearview mirrors. A few reported hearing footsteps outside their homes after encountering her. Whether the stories were true or not, nobody in Cold Creek liked discussing them. I left town that morning and tried to forget the entire experience. A few weeks later, while reviewing photographs from the trip, I found something that still bothers me. One photo showed my truck parked beside Hollow Road shortly after I stopped that night. Standing between the trees behind the vehicle was a blurry figure in a long white dress. I never saw anyone there when I took the picture. Maybe it was just a trick of light and shadow. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. But I know what I saw in my mirror that night, and I know the feeling I had when I looked out the cabin window and found that same figure silently watching from the darkness. Story 7. I never intended to spend the night in the town of Grey Pine. In fact, before 2023, I had never even heard of it. I was driving through the Appalachian mountains on my way to Tennessee, when a severe thunderstorm forced me off the main highway. My GPS redirected me onto a series of narrow mountain roads, and after nearly an hour of driving through heavy rain, I found myself entering a small town hidden deep between the ridges. The place looked almost abandoned. Most of the buildings were old. Many storefronts were empty, and there were very few lights visible, despite it being early evening. Since the weather wasn't improving, I decided to find somewhere to stay for the night. The only place available was a small motel near the center of town. After checking in, I walked to a diner across the street for dinner. While eating, I noticed something strange. Every few minutes, people would glance toward the large window facing the road. Not stare, just quick, nervous looks. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked the waitress what everyone kept looking at. She hesitated before answering. "Nothing," she said. Then she added, "Just don't go outside after midnight." The way she said it immediately got my attention. I laughed and asked if it was some kind of local tradition. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she walked away. Around 11:30 p.m., I returned to my motel room. Rain continued falling outside, and thunder echoed through the mountains. I tried watching television for a while before eventually falling asleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of people talking outside. At first, I assumed it was other motel guests, but something felt off. The voices sounded distant and unusually quiet, almost like whispers. Curious, I looked through the curtains. What I saw instantly made me fully awake. Standing in the middle of the street were dozens of people. Men, women, even children. They were walking slowly through town in complete silence. Nobody carried flashlights. Nobody spoke. They simply moved together down the road. The strange part was that they all wore old-fashioned clothing. Some looked like they belonged in the 1950s. Others appeared even older. I watched for nearly a minute before grabbing my phone to record the scene. When I looked back outside, the street was empty. Every single person had vanished. Thinking exhaustion might be affecting me, I returned to bed. About 30 minutes later, I heard another sound. This time it was knocking. 3 slow knocks on my motel door. I froze. Another 3 knocks followed. Then silence. I carefully approached the door and looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. The parking lot outside was completely empty. As I stepped away from the door, my phone suddenly vibrated. It wasn't a call or a text message. It was an emergency weather alert. The strange thing was the timestamp. The alert wasn't from 2023. Somehow, according to the screen, it was dated July 14, 1977. I stared at it in confusion before the notification disappeared on its own. At that exact moment, the motel room lights flickered and went out. The entire building lost power. Outside, the storm grew louder. Then I heard screaming. Real screaming. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in town. I looked through the window and saw flashing lights in the distance. Fire. A large section of the town appeared to be burning. People were running through the streets. The scene looked chaotic. I grabbed my keys and rushed outside, intending to help if I could. The moment I stepped into the parking lot, everything stopped. The fire disappeared. The streetlights were back on. The town looked completely normal. It was as though the entire event had never happened. Confused and shaken, I returned to my room and stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I told the motel owner everything. To my surprise, he didn't seem shocked. After a long silence, he explained that Grey Pine had suffered a devastating fire in July of 1977. Several buildings in the center of town were destroyed, and multiple residents lost their lives. According to local stories, people occasionally reported seeing strange things on stormy nights near the anniversary of the disaster. Some claimed they witnessed scenes from the fire itself. Others reported seeing groups of people walking through town wearing clothing from different decades. Before leaving, I visited the town library out of curiosity. There, I found old newspaper articles about the fire. One photograph stopped me cold. It showed residents evacuating the burning streets during the disaster. Among the crowd was a man standing near the camera. I recognized him immediately. He was the same person I had seen, staring directly toward my motel window during the silent procession the night before. I left Grey Pine later that afternoon and never returned. Even now, whenever thunderstorms roll through the mountains, I think about that town and the people I saw, walking silently through the darkness, as though they were still trapped in a night that ended nearly 50 years ago. Story 8. I didn't grow up believing in ghosts, monsters, or anything supernatural. Even now, I'm not sure what happened that night in the Appalachian town of Cedar Ridge. All I know is that it scared me more than anything I've experienced before or since. It happened in October of 2022, while I was traveling through the mountains filming content for my outdoor adventure channel. Cedar Ridge was a small, isolated town surrounded by dense forest and steep hills. During the day, it seemed completely normal. People were friendly, businesses were open, and nothing felt unusual. But after sunset, the atmosphere changed. Streets became empty. Porch lights turned on. Curtains closed. It felt as though everyone was preparing for something. That evening, I stopped at a local diner for dinner. While talking with a few residents, I noticed a wooden sign hanging behind the counter. Written on it were the words, "If you hear knocking after midnight, don't answer." Assuming it was a joke, I laughed and asked about it. Nobody laughed with me. The owner simply told me that if I planned on staying in town overnight, I should ignore any knocking I heard after midnight. The conversation ended there. Naturally, that warning stayed in my mind for the rest of the evening. Around 11 p.m., I checked into a small motel near the edge of town. The place was old but clean. By midnight, I was lying in bed, watching television, when I remembered the sign at the diner. I smiled to myself, convinced it was nothing more than a local legend used to scare visitors. Then, at exactly 12:17 a.m., I heard 3 knocks on my door. They were slow, deliberate, and loud enough to echo through the room. I sat upright immediately. At first I thought it was another guest. I waited, expecting someone to call out or knock again. Instead, there was silence. A few minutes passed. Then came another 3 knocks. This time I got up and walked toward the door. Just before reaching it, I remembered the warning. For some reason, I stopped. Looking through the peephole seemed harmless. So I leaned forward and looked outside. The walkway was empty. Nobody stood there. No footsteps moved away. No doors closed. There was simply nobody there. Feeling uneasy, I stepped back. A few seconds later came the 3rd set of knocks. 3 slow taps, then silence. I returned to bed but couldn't sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard movement outside the window. Thinking it might be an animal, I carefully pulled back the curtain. Standing near the tree line behind the motel was a man. He was tall, motionless, and dressed in dark clothing. The distance made it impossible to see his face. What bothered me was that he appeared to be staring directly at my room. I watched him for several seconds. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply stood there. Then my phone rang. The sudden sound made me jump. It was an unknown number. When I answered, I heard only static. Then a voice quietly said, "Don't open the door." The line disconnected immediately. My heart was pounding. I tried calling back, but the number didn't exist. When I looked outside again, the man was gone. At that point, I locked every latch in the room and stayed awake until morning. The next day, I told the motel owner everything. To my surprise, he wasn't shocked. In fact, he seemed disappointed that I had looked outside at all. After some hesitation, he explained a story that locals rarely shared with outsiders. Decades earlier, during the 1960s, several residents disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Witnesses reported hearing knocks on their doors late at night before the disappearances occurred. No evidence was ever found, and none of the missing people were located. Over time, stories developed around the events. Residents began warning each other never to answer unexpected knocks after midnight. Most people dismissed it as folklore, but the tradition remained. Before leaving town, I visited the local historical society, hoping to learn more. There I found old newspaper clippings describing the disappearances. One article included a photograph taken during a community event in 1964. My blood ran cold when I saw it. Standing near the back of the crowd was the same man I had seen near the tree line outside my motel room. The clothing was different, but the face was unmistakable. The article identified him as one of the residents who had disappeared without a trace. Nearly 60 years earlier, I left Cedar Ridge that afternoon and never returned. To this day, I don't know who called me that night or why they warned me not to open the door, but whenever I hear unexpected knocking late at night, I remember that silent figure standing beyond the trees and wonder what might have happened if I had answered. Story 9. I wasn't supposed to be in the town of Red Valley that night. My original plan was to drive straight through the Appalachian Mountains and reach my destination before sunset, but a landslide closed the main highway and forced me onto a series of back roads that wound through remote mountain communities. By the time I reached Red Valley, it was already dark. The town was small, maybe a few hundred residents at most, and it looked like the kind of place where nothing ever happened. I stopped at a gas station to fill up my truck and grab a drink before continuing my trip. While paying, I noticed a bulletin board covered with missing person flyers. There were far more than I would have expected for a town that size. Some of the flyers were recent, but others were years old. Curious, I asked the cashier if the town had a history of disappearances. The woman behind the counter became noticeably uncomfortable. After a moment, she quietly said, "People around here don't go into the woods after dark." Then she changed the subject. I didn't think much of it at the time. After leaving the gas station, I realized I was too tired to keep driving, so I rented a room at a small motel near the edge of town. A few hours later, around midnight, I woke up thirsty and decided to walk to a vending machine located outside near the parking lot. The night was unusually quiet. No traffic, no insects, nothing. As I crossed the lot, I noticed a faint light moving among the trees beyond the motel. At first I assumed it was a flashlight. Then another light appeared. Then another. Within seconds, I counted at least 10 lights weaving slowly through the forest. Curious, I watched for a moment. The lights seemed to be moving in a line, almost like a group of people searching for something. Thinking it might be a search and rescue team, I walked toward the tree line. That's when I heard someone behind me. "Don't go over there." I turned and saw an elderly man standing outside one of the motel rooms. He looked genuinely concerned. When I asked what was happening in the woods, he shook his head and told me to go back inside. Before I could ask more questions, he closed his door. I should have listened. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. About 20 minutes later, I grabbed a flashlight and drove to a small gravel road that ran alongside the forest. From there, I could still see the lights moving between the trees, but deeper I followed them, the stranger things became. Despite the number of lights, I couldn't hear any voices. No conversations, no footsteps, no radio chatter, nothing. Eventually, I parked and continued on foot. The lights remained just far enough ahead that I could never catch up. After nearly 15 minutes of walking, I entered a clearing. The lights had vanished. The forest around me was completely dark. Then I noticed something strange. Hanging from several tree branches were dozens of old photographs. Some were faded and damaged by weather. Others looked relatively new. I stepped closer and immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. Every photograph showed a different person. Men, women, teenagers, even children. Many of the faces looked familiar. Then I realized why. They matched the missing person flyers I had seen at the gas station earlier that evening. I was staring at photographs of people who had disappeared from Red Valley over the years. As I examined them, I heard movement behind me. I turned quickly, expecting another person. Nobody was there. Then I heard it again. Footsteps circling the clearing. Slow, deliberate, crunching leaves under heavy boots. My flashlight beam swept through the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps continued. Suddenly, another light appeared between the trees. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, Dozens of lights surrounded the clearing. They weren't flashlights. They looked more like old lanterns. I could see silhouettes carrying them, but the figures never stepped fully into view. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I backed away slowly and then turned and ran. The footsteps followed immediately. Branches snapped behind me, leaves rustled. It sounded like multiple people moving through the woods. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. The moment I slammed the door shut and started the engine, the sounds ceased. The forest became silent again. The next morning, I returned to the gas station and asked about the clearing. The cashier stared at me for several seconds before finally speaking. According to local stories, people had been disappearing in the forests around Red Valley for generations. Search parties often went looking for the missing, but many searches ended without answers. Some residents believed the lights seen in the woods were connected to those disappearances. Others refused to discuss them at all. Before leaving town, I drove back to the gravel road in daylight, hoping to find the clearing again. After searching for over an hour, I couldn't locate it. There were no photographs, no lanterns, no sign that the place had ever existed. Even stranger, when I checked the photos on my phone from the previous night, every image I had taken in the clearing was completely black. To this day, I have no idea who or what I saw in those woods. All I know is that somewhere beyond Red Valley, hidden among the Appalachian forests, there may be a place where the missing are never truly gone. Story 10. I almost didn't survive the night I'm about to describe. Even now, years later, it's the one experience I never talk about unless someone specifically asks. It happened in the Appalachian town of Willow Creek. During the fall of 2021, I was traveling through the mountains, filming content for a documentary about forgotten towns and local legends. Willow Creek seemed perfect for the project. It was small, isolated, and surrounded by miles of dense forest. When I arrived, but there was something strange about the people. Everyone seemed nervous. Store owners locked their doors earlier than expected, and by sunset the streets were nearly empty. At a diner that evening, I asked a waitress why the town became so quiet after dark. She looked toward the window before answering. "People don't stay outside after midnight," she said. When I asked why, she simply replied, "Because that's when the lights appear." I assumed she was referring to some local ghost story. Unfortunately, my curiosity has always been my biggest weakness. Around 11:45 p.m., I grabbed my camera and drove toward a hill overlooking the town. I wanted to see these mysterious lights for myself. The hill offered a clear view of Willow Creek and the surrounding mountains. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight, I noticed a small white light moving through the forest beyond town. At first, I thought it was a flashlight then. A second light appeared, then a third. Within minutes, dozens of lights drifted silently among the trees. They moved too smoothly to be people walking. Some floated uphill. Others crossed areas so steep that no person could easily navigate them in darkness. Through the zoom lens of my camera, I could see that the lights weren't attached to anything. They simply hovered a few feet above the ground. I continued recording until something even stranger happened. One of the lights suddenly changed direction and began moving toward my position. Then another followed. Soon, several lights were heading up the hill. A feeling of dread settled over me. Every instinct told me to leave. I packed my equipment and hurried back to my truck. Before climbing inside, I glanced toward the forest. The lights were much closer now, close enough that I could estimate their height. Most hovered at about shoulder level. Then I noticed shapes moving beneath them, tall figures, human-shaped but unnaturally thin. They seemed to glide rather than walk. Panic hit me instantly. I jumped into the truck and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I looked into the rearview mirror. Several of the lights had reached the hilltop. The figures stood perfectly still, watching my truck disappear into the darkness. Relieved, I drove back toward town. About halfway there, my engine suddenly died. Every light on the dashboard went dark. The truck rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. I tried restarting it. Nothing happened. Then I saw them. The lights were moving through the forest, on both sides of the road. Slowly, deliberately, getting closer. My hands shook as I repeatedly turned the key. The engine refused to start. Outside, the lights continued approaching. One drifted out of the trees and stopped beside the road roughly 50 feet away. For the first time, I could see it clearly. It wasn't a lantern. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a glowing sphere of pale white light floating in mid-air. Beneath it stood a tall, dark figure. I couldn't make out facial features, only a silhouette. Another light appeared. Then another. Soon there were dozens. They formed a loose circle around the truck. I was trapped. Then, without warning, every light vanished simultaneously. 1 second they were there, the next they were gone. Complete darkness surrounded me. A few moments later, my truck's dashboard flickered back to life. The engine started on the first attempt. I didn't wait around. I drove straight back to the motel and stayed inside until sunrise. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from my camera. The recording showed the lights moving through the forest exactly as I remembered. But near the end of the video, something appeared that I hadn't noticed at the time. As the lights approached the hill, dozens of dark figures could be seen, standing silently among the trees. They weren't moving toward me. They were already there, waiting. Before leaving Willow Creek, I visited the local library, hoping to find some explanation. An old newspaper archive described reports of mysterious lights dating back more than a century. Residents called them the Watchers. According to local legends, the lights appeared before disappearances, accidents, and unexplained deaths in the mountains. Whether the stories were true or not, I can't say. What I can say is that I saw those lights with my own eyes, and I know what stood beneath them. To this day, I still have the original footage stored on a hard drive. I've watched it many times over the years, searching for a rational explanation. I've never found one, and every time I see those silent figures standing in the darkness, I remember the feeling I had on that road. The certainty that if my truck hadn't started when it did, I might never have left Willow Creek at all.